For nearly 3 decades, one handwritten page remained sealed inside a royal archive, protected not by law, but by the determination of one man. Now, a respected royal historian has stepped forward and exposed the existence of Diana's final unpublished note, a deeply personal message concerning Charles, William, and the future of the monarchy. The revelation does not merely reopen an old wound, it threatens to change the meaning of everything the palace allowed the world to believe. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Dr. Eleanor Ashcroft did not make the revelation through whispers. She delivered it during a televised historical symposium, citing notes she created while examining restricted royal correspondence. Eleanor said Diana wrote the message during the final year of her life and marked it for future publication. Then she went further. Charles had read the page and personally ordered it withheld indefinitely. The claim struck at the heart of royal memory. The Royal Archives, the official collection of monarchy documents, contained Diana's letters and interviews. This page was different. Someone had placed it inside a private correspondence file, controlled by the sovereign, meaning the monarch could restrict access without following the usual release timetable. That distinction transformed a family secret into an act of institutional control. Charles watched the symposium recording alone at Clarence House. King remained still until Eleanor described Diana's note as an attempt to stop William from inheriting silence. He paused the recording. His expression hardened, but he did not leave. He replayed the sentence, hearing not only an accusation from the past, but a warning aimed at the son who would inherit his crown. William learned the news before the broadcast ended. When the prince received the call, he did not ask whether the note existed. He understood that Eleanor would never risk her reputation without a documented account. Instead, the future king fell silent and asked one devastating question. Did my father read it? The answer changed the emotional weight of everything that followed. Eleanor then revealed the only surviving sentence in her research notes. Diana had written that the monarchy would eventually be forced to choose between protecting an image and protecting a son. Yet the historian did not possess the original page, and she had no permission to reproduce it. What she did possess was almost as dangerous: a detailed record of the night Charles first discovered the message. To understand why one page frightened the palace more than years of public interviews, the story must move beyond the document and into the private fears of the 3 people whose lives were trapped inside it. The note did not contain the anger of a discarded wife or the bitterness of a defeated rival. Its power came from something far more dangerous. Diana wrote as a mother who believed her eldest son was being prepared for a crown without being protected from its emotional cost. Charles saw accusation in those words. William would eventually see a warning. Between them stood a dead woman whose voice remained powerful enough to divide father and son decades later. William kept the symposium frozen on his screen. Prince sat in silence, hands clenched, until the strain showed. Catherine entered, noticed the paused image of Eleanor, and understood this was not a passing scandal. It reached into his childhood, his mother's fear, and the role that had shaped him before he understood it. Diana had grown fiercely protective during the final years of her marriage. She believed palace expectations were teaching her son to hide pain rather than face it. The crown, the position, and duties carried by Britain's sovereign was already being presented to William as a destiny demanding control. To her, that discipline risked becoming emotional isolation. Charles, restraint protected continuity, prevented private conflict from weakening the institution, and prepared the future king for extraordinary pressure. Catherine moved closer and quietly asked whether he remembered Diana writing late at night. William did. He recalled his mother warning that a crown could become a locked room unless he learned to speak honestly before entering it. The memory did not comfort him. It shook him, because the words now sounded less like advice and more like a plea she feared might never reach him. Eleanor deepened the mystery through her documented symposium account. She explained that Diana named 3 people in the hidden note: Charles, William, and an unidentified senior royal who had witnessed a decisive private confrontation. The historian also revealed that Charles had not first been told the page was intended for eventual publication. He believed it was a private letter, meant only for his son. That detail changed everything. Charles could once have argued that he was shielding William from a painful family message. But after learning Diana wanted the truth preserved, the king still maintained the suppression. His decision no longer looked temporary, it looked deliberate. William stared at Eleanor's frozen face, while Catherine watched his expression change. Somewhere inside the hidden record stood a witness who knew what happened before Diana began writing. That person held the missing link between a mother's warning and a father's silence. That decision was not born from years of general unhappiness. It came from one specific encounter, one closed door, sentence Diana could never forget. Every buried document has a moment of creation, a precise second when emotion becomes evidence. For Diana, that moment came after a private encounter at Kensington Palace in November 1996. What began as a tense discussion about William's future ended with a warning she believed no mother should ever hear. Hours later, unable to sleep, she sat alone beneath a small desk lamp and began writing the page Charles would later fight to keep from the world. Diana had already endured the end of her marriage, but the divorce had not ended the argument over their son. William was being drawn deeper into royal responsibility, and every new duty seemed to demand more control from him. Palace advisors wanted the young prince protected from further controversy. To them, shielding meant keeping private grief away from public attention. To his mother, it was becoming another word for silence. Charles saw the matter differently. Crown, the authority and public duty carried by the monarch, could not survive. He believed, if personal emotion ruled every decision. He wanted William prepared for pressure, criticism, and sacrifice. Diana feared that preparation was teaching the boy to hide pain before he had learned how to understand it. The confrontation came on 18 November 1996. Charles arrived at Kensington Palace for a private discussion about William's future schedule and responsibilities. The conversation began carefully, but the restraint did not last. When Diana questioned how much more pressure their son could carry, he answered with the sentence that changed everything. The crown cannot be raised around one boy's feelings. Diana rose from her chair. The words wounded her, because they reduced William's fear, grief, and confusion to obstacles standing in the way of duty. She told Charles that treating their son as an heir before treating him as a child would eventually drive him away, not only from his father, but from the institution both parents expected him to serve. Charles did not withdraw the statement. He left with the disagreement unresolved, believing discipline would one day protect William. Diana remained convinced that emotional silence would destroy something inside him long before the crown ever reached him. The closed door became the point of no return. Diana returned to her desk, removed a sheet of cream stationery, and wrote until shortly before dawn. Margaret Bell, her private secretary, a trusted aide, responsible for personal correspondence, later saw her seal the page with trembling hands. Diana gave Margaret one clear instruction. William must receive the note when he was emotionally ready. And if the palace ever rewrote the reason she fought over his upbringing, the message must be made public. Margaret kept that promise hidden, but secrecy could not last forever. When Charles finally held the envelope, he was not confronting a memory of Diana. He was confronting a message designed to survive him, and he demanded to know who else had read it. The most dangerous confrontation in this story did not occur between Charles and Diana. It happened years later, inside a private library, when a historian placed her research notes on a table and told the future king that history did not belong to him alone. No aides were present. No official record was made. Yet both understood that Diana's sealed message had become more than family correspondence. It had become a battle over who possessed the right to define the past. Eleanor entered that battle in 2005. She had been invited to review selected letters for an authorized study of Diana's public legacy. But the rules were strict. An authorized study meant a project approved by royal officials, with access limited to material they considered safe. Anything involving William or Harry's childhood was excluded. The restriction mattered because it allowed the palace to celebrate Diana's last charity work, while keeping her fiercest private concerns beyond reach. One mistake changed everything. Eleanor found a mislabeled archive reference attached to a routine correspondence list. It led to a memorandum written by Margaret Bell, describing the sealed note, naming William as its intended recipient, and recording Diana's instruction that the page could one day be released. Eleanor copied the reference into her research notes and requested a private meeting with Charles. Charles received her at Highgrove without advisors. When Eleanor asked why the page had vanished from every archive catalog, he closed the file immediately. An archive catalog is the official record showing what documents exist and how they are classified. Removing the note from that record meant future researchers would never know to search for it. The future king told her the matter concerned his son, not history. Eleanor refused to retreat. She argued that Diana had explicitly wanted William to possess the truth. Charles answered that a mother's final wish did not give anyone the right to place an adult son inside his parents' unresolved war. He believed release would force the prince to choose between grief and loyalty. She believed suppression had already made that choice for him. The confrontation broke open. Eleanor pushed Margaret's memorandum across the table and said, "You have no right to bury her voice." Charles did not shout. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the document, and ordered the file closed. Eleanor gathered her notes, but one handwritten line stopped her. Beside the restriction, someone had written, "No release during my lifetime or his without consent." The second pronoun could only mean William. Charles appeared to control the note completely. Yet Eleanor soon discovered that his authority depended on trustees, private secretaries, and one dangerous assumption that William would remain silent forever. The note remained hidden not because one lock protected it, but because an entire structure of loyalty had been built around Charles's fear of what would happen if William finally read it. Royal power rarely announces itself with a command shouted across a palace corridor. More often, it appears as a signature beneath carefully chosen language, a file moved to another cabinet, or a trusted official deciding that loyalty matters more than transparency. Diana's note disappeared through precisely that kind of machinery. Charles supplied the determination, but others supplied the silence, and one of them eventually began to question whether protecting the monarch had become an act of betrayal against his son. Sir Jonathan Vail carried the burden first. As an archive trustee, he was responsible for protecting sensitive historical documents and deciding who could access them. Michael Harcourt, the private secretary managing delicate family requests, controlled the paper trail around the restriction. Alongside Charles, the two men formed a quiet barrier no researcher could cross. The classification gave that barrier its strength. Diana's page had been labeled personal sovereign correspondence, meaning a private document placed under the monarch's direct control rather than the normal schedule for releasing historical papers. Researchers could not quote it, confirm it, or even acknowledge its existence without permission. The system did not destroy the truth. It made the truth unreachable. Jonathan felt the danger after Eleanor submitted her formal challenge through a documented archive request. He entered the secure room alone, opened the sealed file, and began reading. The first lines described William's emotional isolation. When the trustee reached the prince's name, he stopped. He understood that the page was not simply an attack on Charles. It was a mother's warning, written for her son. Jonathan confronted Charles privately. The trustee admitted that the restriction remained legally defensible, warned that it had become morally unstable. King answered that publication would force William to judge his father through the words of a mother he still mourned. He insisted that silence had protected the prince from carrying the full weight of their marriage. Camilla found Charles later with the authorization form still in his hand. The queen consort listened as he defended the decision, then offered a warning of her own. Permanent silence, she told him, could make protection look exactly like guilt. Charles heard her. He understood her fear, but he signed the renewed embargo anyway. Jonathan received the signed order and made one secret change. An embargo was a formal restriction preventing the document's release. Beneath it, the trustee added a clause allowing William, as Diana's intended recipient, to request a private reading once Charles became king. Years passed. Charles forgot the clause. Jonathan did not. Then Eleanor exposed the note publicly, and the buried provision suddenly became active. The historian had opened the door, but she no longer controlled what happened next. Machinery had protected Charles for years. The moment William learned that the final choice belonged to him, every locked door inside the palace began to feel temporary. Within hours of Eleanor's disclosure, the palace discovers that silence has consequences of its own. William does not issue a statement, contact the press, or publicly challenge his father. He does something far more threatening. He sends a formal request to read the note privately. The document travels through royal offices with the force of an ultimatum. By sunset, advisors are no longer debating whether Diana's words should become public. They are debating whether Charles can survive his son seeing them at all. William invokes the clause naming him as Diana's intended recipient. The prince requests the complete note, Margaret's memorandum, and every order used to delay its delivery. Legal channel, a formal written process that creates an official record, carries the demand directly into the royal system. He bypasses family calls and private messages, making one fact impossible to ignore. The future king no longer trusts reassurance from his father. Charles receives the request during an afternoon briefing. The king dismisses every advisor, reads the page once, then reads it again. He places it face down without speaking. That silence unsettles the room more than anger would have, because the monarch understands what the request contains. William is not merely asking to read his mother's words. He is asking to see every decision his father made to keep them away from him. Camilla finds Charles after the briefing and urges him to act before the file is released. Queen Consort tells him to meet his son, explain the fear behind the restriction, and speak before Diana's words speak for him. He refuses. He believes William will interpret any conversation as pressure. Yet the king's hesitation creates exactly what she fears: a wider distance, filled by years of unanswered questions. Catherine finds William walking alone outside Windsor. She stays beside him until he finally admits the truth. He is not most afraid of what Diana wrote. The prince is terrified that the records will prove Charles chose control at the moment honesty was still possible. Catherine reminds him that reading the page does not require him to condemn his father, but she can see that the wound has already opened. Jonathan delivers the final confirmation through a documented archive memorandum. The trustee explains that Diana never asked William to reject Charles or abandon the crown. Instead, she warned him never to confuse loyalty with emotional obedience. The difference is devastating. Her message was not rebellion, it was protection. William now has the right to open the file, but he delays. Before reading one word, he requests a private meeting with Charles, without secretaries, lawyers, or Camilla present. For the first time, the crisis moves beyond historians and archive rules, leaving only a father and son, with nowhere left to hide from each other. There are confrontations built on anger, and there are confrontations built on exhaustion. When William enters the private room at Windsor, he carries no folder and brings no advisor. Charles is already waiting beside a window, older, wearier, and stripped of the authority that normally surrounds him. For several seconds, neither speaks. The hidden note is not in the room, yet Diana's presence fills every silence between them. What follows is not an argument over history. It is a reckoning between father and son. William asked for this meeting before reading a single line. Prince wanted his father's explanation to exist without the pressure of Diana's words shaping it first. No private secretary stood nearby. Private secretary is the senior aide who usually manages royal correspondence, meetings, and sensitive decisions. Without that institutional protection, Charles could not hide behind procedure. His son could not pretend the matter belonged only to historians. Charles spoke carefully at first. The king admitted that he feared the note would turn William's grief into a permanent judgment against him. Diana had written from pain, and he believed one page might reduce their complicated marriage to a simple story of victim and villain. He told his son that withholding it had seemed at the time, like protection. William listened without interrupting. Then the future king asked the question Charles had spent decades avoiding. Were you protecting me, or protecting the version of yourself you needed me to believe? The words landed without anger. That made them worse. The prince was not shouting, threatening, or demanding revenge. He was looking at his father with disappointment so deep that defense suddenly sounded empty. Charles tried to explain the burden of duty, but his certainty began to collapse. The monarch finally admitted that Diana's warning had felt like an attack because it named the weakness he feared most in himself. Whenever love demanded honesty, he had retreated into responsibility. Whenever pain became difficult to face, he had called silence discipline. William did not offer instant forgiveness. He told Charles that keeping the page from him had stolen a choice that belonged to both Diana and her son. Yet the prince also refused to turn the note into a weapon. He requested a private reading and asked the king to authorize a truthful historical summary, instead of publishing every intimate word. Charles agreed. The decision did not erase what he had done, but it ended his attempt to control what his son was allowed to know. For the first time, the king accepted that honesty might wound the monarchy less than secrecy already had. Outside Windsor, Eleanor's documented revelation was spreading across front pages, broadcasts, and gathering crowds. The private reckoning had ended, but the public judgment was only beginning. Father and son have finally chosen honesty inside the room, but beyond its walls, the world is already deciding what Charles's silence says about the monarchy. By morning, Diana's hidden note is no longer a private royal dispute. It becomes the only story Britain wants to discuss. Some see a grieving father who made a flawed attempt to protect his son. Others see a king who controlled the words of a woman whose voice had once challenged the palace, more powerfully than any politician. Yet one image captures the national mood. A newspaper held above a silent crowd, bearing a headline the monarchy can no longer ignore. News organizations rebuild the story hour by hour. They trace Eleanor's documented confrontation with Charles, the archive restriction, and William's legal right to receive the message as Diana's named recipient. That right matters, because it destroys the idea that the page belonged only to the king. It was written for the prince, yet he had spent decades unaware that his mother had tried to reach him. Palace communications officials struggled to answer. These officials manage the monarchy's public statements and protect its reputation during a crisis. They cannot reveal Diana's intimate words without violating William's privacy. Yet they cannot dismiss her instructions without making the institution appear willing to silence her again. Every possible response carries danger. Outside Kensington Palace, the story becomes painfully real. A crowd gathers beside the memorial gates, where flowers and messages once carried a nation's grief. One woman raises the fictional London Chronicle above her head. Its front page declares, "Diana's last warning, and the king who locked it away." The people around her fall silent, and that silence feels heavier than outrage. A broadcaster gives the scandal its sharpest meaning during a live evening program. He calls it a test of whether the modern monarchy can acknowledge painful truth without believing that honesty itself threatens the crown. His words spread because they capture the conflict exactly. Charles tried to protect stability, but the secrecy now places that stability in greater danger. Eleanor watches the coverage from home and begins to cry. The historian feels no triumph. He fears Diana's private concern for William is becoming another public spectacle, consumed by headlines before the prince has been allowed to understand it himself. Eleanor exposed the suppression to restore truth, not to turn a mother's warning into entertainment. The palace finally acts. A jointly approved statement confirms that William has received access to the note, and that Charles accepts the original restriction continued far longer than it should have. The admission ends the official secrecy, but it does not settle the moral question. William now holds the final power. He can expose every word, or protect the part of Diana that belonged only to her son. With the palace finally admitting the truth, William must decide whether justice requires publication, or whether breaking the cycle of exploitation means protecting the very words others tried to control. William reads the note alone, There are no cameras, historians, advisors, or palace officials beside him. Only his mother's handwriting, preserved across decades of silence. Truth. She wanted him to understand. When he reaches the final line, he folds the page carefully, rather than collapsing beneath it. Diana had not asked him to punish his father. She had asked him to remain emotionally free. In that quiet realization, the document loses its power to divide and finally fulfills its purpose. William finally understands the fear behind every sentence. Diana believed royal stability could demand such complete emotional control that her son might lose the ability to admit pain, challenge authority, or ask for help. Crown the duties, authority, and public burden carried by the monarch could give him purpose. It could also isolate him inside the role he had inherited at birth. Diana's words carry no demand for revenge. She does not ask William to reject Charles, turn against the monarchy, or expose every private wound to the public. Instead, his mother asks him to remain compassionate, without becoming obedient to silence. She wants the prince to serve, without surrendering the part of himself capable of speaking honestly. William places one hand over the folded page. When Catherine joins him, he tells her the truth, with painful calm. His mother was never trying to pull him away from his father. She was trying to make sure he never disappeared inside him. Catherine hears both grief and relief in his voice, because the note has finally given him understanding, without demanding hatred. William meets Charles again soon afterward. The future king tells his father plainly that withholding the message was wrong. Charles does not defend the order or hide behind royal duty. The king accepts the judgment without qualification and apologizes for allowing fear to control a decision that belonged to Diana and their son. William then makes the final choice. He authorizes a formal historical summary, a verified public record, explaining the document, without reproducing every private sentence. The summary confirms Diana's warning and Charles's suppression order, but the handwritten original remains protected. Her most intimate words will not become merchandise, headlines, or another spectacle. Eleanor accepts the decision through a recorded interview. The historian explains that truth has entered the public record. Diana's intention has been honored, and Charles can no longer shape history through silence. She never needed every sentence exposed. She needed the truth acknowledged. The monarchy changes with that acknowledgement. Protecting the crown can no longer mean erasing uncomfortable voices. Diana's note does not destroy Charles or separate him from William. It forces both men to choose truth over image, ending the silence that began in 1996. And so the page Charles once feared becomes neither a weapon nor a scandal, but a final act of maternal protection, restoring Diana's voice, confronting a king's mistake, and freeing her son to inherit the crown without inheriting the silence that surrounded it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.